As I mentioned in my video ranking the best to worst Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VIII is, without a doubt, the title in the franchise where I've spent the most hours playing, even though I recognize it's not among the best and has some notable flaws. Still, many of those flaws can be worked around, and even when they can't, there are enough merits to make the game enjoyable and easy to love. Let's dive into the review. First, let's recap the story. Final Fantasy VIII unfolds in a world that blends elements of fantasy and science fiction, focusing on a group of young mercenaries known as Seed, trained at Balamb Garden. The protagonist is Squall Leonhardt, a reserve student skilled in the use of the gunblade. The story kicks off with a duel between Squall and another cadet, Cypher, leaving both of them with identical facial scars. After recovering, Squall takes part in a quick test against Ifrit, and then a practical exam to officially become a member of Seed, an elite mercenary force. The mission takes place in the coastal city of Dalit, which has been invaded by Galbadia's army. During the operation, Cypher disobeys orders and abandons his team, forcing Squall and Zeldinch to push forward without him. Midway through the mission, Selphie Tilmit, a cadet recently transferred from Trebia Garden, joins the group. Despite Cypher's desertion, the mission is ultimately successful, and Squall, Zell, and Selphie are promoted to full-fledged members of Seed, while Cypher is reprimanded for his insubordination. It's a frenetic, instructive, and, above all, very fun opening act, giving players a dynamic introduction to both the game's mechanics and the tone of its narrative. During the graduation ball, Squall meets Rinoa Hartilli, an outgoing young woman and leader of a small resistance group called the Forest Owls, who fight against Galbadia's military occupation of Timber. The Seed's first official mission is to assist the Forest Owls in an attempt to kidnap the Galbadian president, Vinzer Delling. Before that, however, the game throws in a somewhat awkward sequence at the end of the ball, a forced interaction between Quistis and Squall, hinting at a potential romantic interest between them. The situation culminates in both of them rescuing alone, in a scene that feels sudden, lacks proper context, and honestly, makes very little narrative sense. But it happens, and we move on. Before proceeding with the mission, the characters begin to experience strange dreams, reliving the memories of Laguna Loire, a former Galbadian soldier who left the military to become a journalist and eventually the president of Esthar. These dreams provide important fragments of past events that later prove essential to the unfolding story. Laguna is a charismatic character, and the stories we experience through him are genuinely interesting. However, these dream sequences end up breaking the game's pacing too much, and even now, I still don't fully understand the exact purpose behind each one within the broader narrative. Back in the present, the group plans the kidnapping of President Delling in Timber. However, the plan fails, as the president was already aware of the attempt. During the course of the mission, the group discovers that a powerful sorceress named Idea is manipulating events from behind the scenes. During a live TV broadcast, Cypher storms the station and confronts the president. Amid the chaos, Idea appears, easily subdues Cypher, and in a rather enigmatic move, takes both him and Delling with her. This entire sequence in Timber drags on a bit longer than necessary, although to be fair, it never becomes truly boring. Recognizing the threat posed by Idea, Seed, now composed of Squall, Rinoa, Zell, Selphie, Quistis, and the sharpshooter Irvine Caneas, is assigned the mission to assassinate her. At this point, the game really starts to pad out the content with a lot of dialogue and unnecessary events, but the actual plan is a straightforward ambush during a parade in Delling City, Galbadia's capital. However, the attempt fails when Idea displays powers far beyond what was anticipated, easily repelling the attack and severely wounding Squall. To make matters worse, Cypher, who had deserted Seed, reappears as an ally of the sorceress, further complicating the situation. The assassination attempt ends with the group being captured and imprisoned, while Idea consolidates her power, setting the stage for the events to come. After the chaotic events in Delling, Squall and his companions are taken to the D-District Prison, a maximum security facility located in the desert. While imprisoned, they experience yet another sequence of dreams, once again stepping into the roles of Laguna Loire and his allies. In this vision, Laguna lives in the quiet village of Winhill, acting as a local protector alongside Rain and taking care of Alone, a young girl with mysterious abilities. After patrolling the village and interacting with the townsfolk, Laguna returns to his daily routine, and the group wakes up back to the harsh reality of prison life. Just a side note that nobody asked for, Win Hill is, in my opinion, the coziest town in the entire game, even more so than Balam. Very reminiscent of the vibe of Calm in Final Fantasy VII. However, in terms of gameplay, Win Hill offers absolutely nothing to explore. It's just another beautiful, but ultimately empty backdrop. Back in their cell, Zell, Quistis, and Selphie come up with an escape plan. Zell manages to recover the group's weapons, allowing them to fight their way through the prison guards and initiate a daring escape across the prison's many levels. Meanwhile, Squall is interrogated by Cypher, now serving as Idea's loyal right-hand man. After a series of confrontations and a fair amount of narrative stalling, the group finally manages to escape. During their escape, they discover that Galbadia is planning to launch missiles at both Balam Garden and Trabia Garden, aiming to eliminate any remaining opposition to Idea's rule. Faced with the urgency of the situation, the group splits up. One team, led by Squall, returns to Balam Garden to warn them of the imminent attack, while another, led by Selphie, heads to the Galbadian missile base on a sabotage mission. The decision to split the group into two teams strikes me as a creative solution to a common question that fans sometimes raise. Why do RPGs often force us to choose only 3 or other amount party members instead of letting us take the full team? Here, at least, the split feels justified within the narrative. Selphie and her team manage to infiltrate the missile base, but face several difficulties when trying to disable the launch. Although they aren't able to completely prevent the attack, they manage to delay it at the cost of the base's destruction, leaving their fate uncertain. Meanwhile, Squall and his team arrive at Balam Garden and discover that the facility hides a secret mobility function. After activating it, the garden transforms into a floating fortress, narrowly escaping destruction. While the missile-based sequence drags on with endless dialogue, backtracking, and busy work, the Balam section shifts focus toward exploring the garden's underground areas and surviving wave after wave of battles. In both cases, it becomes clear that the game is starting to test the player's patience. However, the missiles weren't the only problem. Squall soon discovers that Balam Garden's leadership is in disarray. Headmaster Sid Kramer is being hunted down by Norg, a mysterious Shumi who financed the creation of the garden and is now demanding that the seeds submit to Galbadia's authority to avoid retaliation. Squall's group is forced to confront him, and upon defeating Norg, they learn important details about the origin of Seed, and about Sid's marriage for that matter. With Norg out of the way, Sid retakes control of the garden, and clarifies that Seed's true purpose has always been to fight sorceresses, including Idea herself, a fact that will become crucial later on. After resolving the internal conflict, the garden receives a visit from the White Ship, a vessel requesting the presence of Alone. Squall has a brief conversation with her, but it leaves him with even more questions than answers. Nevertheless, he decides to send Alone off with the White Ship, hoping to keep her safely out of the conflict. However, the garden's navigation systems are damaged, and during their journey, the floating facility accidentally collides with Fisherman's Horizon, a peaceful community of engineers. While repairs are underway, Squall is forced to confront his responsibilities as a leader and begins to reflect on his feelings for Renoa. The stay at Fisherman's Horizon offers the group a brief moment of rest and introspection before they are inevitably pulled back into new conflicts, this time involving the search for Alone and the growing threat posed by Idea. During their time in Fisherman's Horizon, Selphie's team, who had survived the missile base explosion, manages to reunite with the rest of the group. Together, they resume their mission. There's also a sequence where the characters help set up a musical performance as part of the town's activities, but to be honest, nobody really cares about that part. Squall is then officially appointed as the leader of Balam Garden, and his first decision is to liberate the city of Balam, which had been seized by Galbadia's forces. The occupation is led by Fujin and Raijin, Cypher's loyal subordinates, who are also searching for Aloni. Determined to reclaim the city, Squall and his companions infiltrate Balam, confront the duo, and successfully liberate the town. After the victory, Selphie suggests visiting Trabia Garden, her childhood home, to assess the damage caused by the missile attacks. Upon arrival, the group finds the institution in ruins, bearing clear signs of Galbadia's devastation. During their visit, conversations with the survivors and the emotionally charged atmosphere lead to a major revelation. All of the party members, except for Renoa, grew up together in an orphanage under Idea's care, but forgot about it due to the memory-erasing side effects of using Guardian forces. This revelation should have added a new layer of emotional complexity to their mission, as the Seeds now realize they must fight someone who was once a maternal figure to them all, but it is quickly forgotten. With more questions than answers, Squall decides to travel to the ruins of Idea's orphanage in search of more clues about their past. However, before the group can properly investigate the area, they are ambushed by Galbadian troops, who continue their relentless pursuit. The clash culminates in a chaotic battle, forcing Squall and his allies to fend off a massive enemy force. After defeating the Galbadian troops, the group finally comes face to face with Cypher once again, who remains obsessed with serving the sorceress. Despite his stubborn determination, Cypher is defeated yet again, although he still refuses to give up. With the path cleared, Squall and his companions press forward toward a direct confrontation with Idea. The battle against the sorceress is intense, but by the end of the fight, Idea suddenly regains her senses as if she had been freed from an external force that was controlling her. However, before the group can understand what just happened, Rinoa, in an impulsive act to save Cypher, ends up falling into a catatonic and inexplicable state. In short, Rinoa saves Cypher, but falls into a coma herself. After the major battle, the group meets with Idea and Sid at the orphanage. Idea then reveals that she had been under the control of a powerful sorceress from the future named Ultimecia, whose goal is to find Alone in order to manipulate the past and ultimately seize absolute control over time. Faced with this revelation, the group sets out to find Alone, hoping she might hold the key to saving Rinoa. When they locate the ship where Alone had been hiding, they are informed that she has already departed for Esthar. Before they can embark on their next journey, another dream involving Laguna takes place, but with no time for further explanations, Squall decides to act. Carrying the unconscious Rinoa in his arms, he follows the railway tracks from Fisherman's Horizon toward Esthar, eventually reuniting with the rest of the group along the way, now also joined by Idea, and they continue the journey together. After a series of mostly irrelevant events, the group finally arrives in Esthar, where yet another Laguna dream sequence occurs. A few other low-impact events unfold until the group eventually learns that Alone has been taken to Esthar's space station. At that point, the group splits again. One part remains on the ground in Esthar, while the other prepares to head into space. While the team in Esthar witnesses the arrival of Lunatic Pandora, now controlled by Galbadian forces under Cypher's command, who plan to trigger the lunar cry, the other team reaches the space station. There, Rinoa is placed under observation, and Alone answers more questions about her ability to send consciousnesses back through time. During their stay at the station, the team discovers that Adele, a powerful sorceress from the past, has been sealed inside an orbital prison, and that Ultimecia plans to use Rinoa as a vessel to free her. Under Ultimecia's control, Rinoa escapes containment and succeeds in releasing Adele. Simultaneously, the lunar cry is triggered, bringing Adele crashing back down to Esthar. After fulfilling this forced role, Rinoa is cast into the vast emptiness of space. Determined to save her, Squall embarks on what is essentially a suicide mission, while the rest of the team escapes the station via emergency pods. Against all odds, drifting through space, Squall and Rinoa eventually stumble upon the Ragnarok, an abandoned transport ship. After clearing the ship of monsters, Squall and Rinoa manage to take control of the Ragnarok and successfully return to Esthar. After landing, the scientists in Esthar suggest sealing Rinoa away to prevent Ultimecia from continuing to use her as a vessel, and Squall, still without any clear alternatives, reluctantly agrees. However, he quickly realizes it was the wrong decision and sets out to rescue her. After the rescue and a whole lot of talking, as is customary in this part of the game, the team finally reunites with Laguna, who is now revealed to be the president of Esthar. Laguna, after even more lengthy dialogue, presents a plan to defeat Ultimecia, allow her to initiate time compression, creating an opportunity for Alone to send the group's consciousnesses into the past and confront Ultimecia directly. But first, the group needs to rescue Alone, who has been captured and taken to Lunatic Pandora. Just a quick side note, if up until the garden battle the game seemed determined to drag everything out with slow, drawn-out sequences, from this point onward the opposite happens. Everything starts moving at breakneck speed, one event crashing into the next, without giving the player much time to process or absorb anything properly. The group then heads to Lunatic Pandora, where they face Cypher and his forces. During the battle, Fujin and Raijin regret their actions and try to convince Cypher to abandon his plans. However, In his usual stubborn fashion, Cypher refuses to listen. And in a move that doesn't make much sense, yeah, I know, how did he even manage? He somehow manages to kidnap Rinoa. With Rinoa now fused to Adele, the group must defeat the powerful sorceress without harming Rinoa in the process. The battle itself, like many others in Final Fantasy VIII, isn't particularly challenging. Once Rinoa is rescued, Aloni finally puts the plan into motion. She sends the group's consciousnesses into the past, and the time compression begins. Inside Ultimicia's castle, the group faces a series of creative and fun gameplay challenges, fighting through multiple battles on their way to the final confrontation. After an intense fight, Squall and his friends manage to defeat Ultimecia, stopping the time compression and restoring order to the universe. Here, there's a lot of inventive gameplay, but admittedly, very little story progression. However, even with Ultimecia defeated, time begins to normalize in an unstable way, and Squall finds himself lost in a timeless dimension. Wandering through this strange space, he is eventually led to the garden where he was supposed to meet Rinoa and ends up encountering a younger version of Edea, as well as himself as a child. In that moment, Ultimecia, in her final moments, passes her powers to Edea, completing a bootstrap paradox that, in practice, seals the fate of the entire cycle. The game concludes with a celebration at Baylam Garden, where the characters reflect on their journeys and the future they helped secure. Squall and Rinoa share an intimate moment under the starry sky, hinting at a new beginning for both of them, while Zell, true to form, manages to choke on a hot dog. The story of Final Fantasy VIII is, without a doubt, one of the most hotly debated aspects among fans of the franchise. For some, the plot is elaborate and engaging, offering a more complex and mature approach, with memorable characters and a narrative structure that sets it apart from other entries in the series. For others, however, the story feels weak and confusing, plagued by a sudden acceleration toward the end, a romance perceived as forced, and an ever-shifting antagonism that makes it hard to maintain a consistent sense of progression and cohesion. Opinion. Problems in lore construction and narrative development. One of the biggest problems with Final Fantasy VIII's story is that a large portion of its universe remains hidden in secondary details, scattered NPC dialogues, or external materials like guides and magazines. Fundamental aspects of the lore, such as the origin of the sorceress's powers, the history of the kingdoms, the nature of guardian forces, and the characters' pasts, are only superficially touched on within the game itself. Instead of naturally weaving this information into the main narrative, the game forces players to actively search for scattered hints, and even then, many important pieces remain missing. This fragmented approach creates a constant sense of narrative gaps, weakening emotional engagement, and making the story feel less cohesive and impactful than it could have been. Another controversial point is the sudden acceleration of the narrative in the final third of the game. The plot introduces several antagonists over the course of the story. First Edea, then Cypher, followed by Adele, and finally Ultimecia. While the game drops subtle hints that Ultimecia is the true villain, the information is so sparse and underplayed that it fails to build any real anticipation. Her name isn't even mentioned for the majority of the game, and when she does finally appear, her introduction feels abrupt and lacks dramatic weight. For most of the journey, the player is led to believe that Edea is the central threat, a solid narrative arc that could have been much better developed. Instead, the sudden shift to Ultimecia undermines the sense of progression and continuity, making it feel like an abrupt and poorly handled change of antagonists. From the final third of Disc 3 onward, the story shifts into overdrive, with major events unfolding simultaneously and very little screen time dedicated to building them up. Important revelations, such as the true nature of Rinoa, the plan for time compression, and Adele's backstory, are rushed through, practically dumped on the player without proper narrative buildup. This rushed pace culminates in Disc 4, which essentially consists only of the final dungeon. Plot elements that deserved greater development end up crammed into short dialogues or rapid-fire sequences, not only causing confusion, but also severely diminishing the emotional impact of the story's climax. An additional flaw, often underestimated, but one I find particularly notable, is the drastic limitation of exploration in Disc 4. Using the excuse that time is compressed, the game blocks access to cities and locations across the world, restricting the player to the overworld map and a few dimensional portals. This decision completely breaks the sense of freedom the player has been building throughout the game, right at the moment when the desire to explore and tackle side quests is at its peak. Worse yet, the game could easily have introduced new challenges or exclusive side quests tied to the theme of temporal chaos. Instead, Disc 4 feels empty, serving only as a straight path to the final dungeon, wasting an opportunity to make the game's closing act richer, more emotional, and far more memorable. Questionable narrative choices. Several of the writing decisions in Final Fantasy VIII are frequently criticized, and not without good reason. A clear example is the justification for the character's memory loss. The idea that continuous use of GFs causes gradual amnesia. Although the concept itself had potential, its execution is shallow and unconvincing. The revelation that all the main characters grew up together in an orphanage should have been a major emotional turning point, but the explanation feels forced, with no prior build-up and no meaningful consequences for the group's dynamics. The memory loss doesn't substantially affect their behavior either before or after the revelation, which further weakens its narrative importance. More creative alternatives, like Idea casting a spell to erase their memories to protect the children, would have made much more sense within the game's own logic, and could have significantly reinforced the story's emotional impact. Another problematic aspect is Laguna Loire's lack of action until the very final moments of the story. As the president of S-Star, the most technologically advanced nation in the world, it's only natural to expect Laguna to play a decisive role in the fight against Ultimecia and in the global resistance against the sorceress threat. Yet he's portrayed for most of the game as a passive figure, detached from the main events. His reintroduction as president feels more like a narrative necessity to connect the dream sequences to the main plot, rather than a natural evolution of his character. This makes his role in the story feel artificial, as if he were inserted mainly to justify the existence of the dream segments, wasting what could have been a powerful and emotionally impactful character arc. Beyond these major issues, the script is also peppered with small moments that reveal a lack of polish in the story's development. One example is the scene where Quistis goes back to apologize to Rinoa and, for no logical reason, ends up trapped inside Delling City's mansion, clearly a forced plot device to create tension during the mission. Another case is when the team hides inside a tank to survive the missile base explosion, a solution so implausible that it breaks the internal logic of the world. While these moments may seem minor individually, they accumulate over the course of the game, gradually undermining immersion and reinforcing the sense that the script, at times, is more concerned with filling space and justifying events than with building a truly solid and organic narrative. Attempts to create impactful moments that fall flat. The memory loss caused by using GFs highlights another clear narrative problem in Final Fantasy VIII, the recurring attempt to insert dramatic moments that, in practice, fail to deliver the expected emotional weight. The game often sets up situations that, in theory, should deeply affect the player, but they end up being resolved abruptly or without any real consequences, diluting any potential impact they might have had. A clear example is Squall's supposed death at the end of Disc 1. After being impaled by Idea and collapsing unconscious, the scene heavily implies a tragic fate. However, at the beginning of Disc 2, Squall simply wakes up in a prison cell, with no explanation whatsoever about how he survived. This lack of justification breaks the narrative logic and completely deflates the emotional impact the scene could have had. As said before, another case is during the missile-based sabotage mission. The game builds a strong atmosphere of imminent sacrifice around Selphie's team, but after the base explodes, the narrative cuts away so abruptly that all the tension evaporates. Shortly after, the group reappears alive and unharmed, with no convincing explanation, draining what should have been a powerful emotional moment. The orphanage revelation had enormous emotional potential, but it's wasted. The revelation is mentioned briefly and then quickly forgotten, without affecting the relationships between the characters or generating any meaningful conflicts that could have enriched the narrative. The relationship between Idea and Cid could have added significant drama to the story, but it is handled superficially. As the founders of the gardens and parental figures to the protagonists, the emotional conflict of having to fight Idea deserved more space and weight. Instead, the game reduces this connection to a peripheral detail, missing an opportunity to deepen the story's emotional core. The revelation that Laguna is the president of S-Star also tries to create a big surprise, but fails due to a lack of preparation and development. Despite Laguna's charisma during the dream sequences, his absence from the main events makes it hard for the player to care about his role or see any practical relevance to his leadership. The arc where Rinoa is sealed away to prevent her possession by Ultimachia further illustrates the game's tendency to rush through major events. Her capture and rescue happen so quickly that the emotional impact is lost, leaving the impression that the drama was inserted merely to create a momentary sense of urgency, without any lasting consequences. All these examples reveal a recurring pattern in Final Fantasy VIII's script: the attempt to create moments that would add emotional depth and intensity to the narrative. But because they are poorly developed or resolved too simplistically, they fail to produce the intended effect. The result is a story filled with potentially grand events that too often fall short of becoming truly memorable experiences for the player. The incoherence of the Gardens' functioning. The concept of the Gardens as independent mercenary institutions is a promising idea, but one that ultimately fails to hold up throughout the narrative. In theory, seeds are trained to sell their services to nations and groups in need, operating as a highly specialized military-for-hire force. However, over the course of the game, this function is barely explored and practically ignored. Aside from the initial mission in Dalit, which serves more as a practical exam than a true mercenary contract, and the hiring of Irvine for the assassination attempt on Edea, there is little concrete evidence that seeds are actively involved on the global stage. While armies like those of Galbadia and Esthar are directly engaged in the major political and military conflicts that drive the plot, the seeds are portrayed instead as an isolated group, seemingly concerned only with defending Balam Garden itself. This disconnect between the concept presented and the narrative execution weakens the organization's impact within the world of the game. What could have been a complex network of alliances, contracts, and international conflicts ends up reduced to internal strife, missing the diversity of missions one would expect from a true mercenary academy. Moreover, the game misses countless opportunities to create side conflicts, diplomatic missions, or field operations that would reinforce the mercenary nature of the seeds. Instead, the only actual hired mission we see is the disastrous Forest Owls operation to kidnap a president, a plan that not only fails spectacularly, but also undermines the very notion of professionalism that seeds were supposed to embody. With no new external demands and no sense of being key players in the world's political chessboard, the seeds lose relevance and fall short of the role that the story initially promised. Beyond the poorly developed mercenary aspect, the internal functioning of the Gardens themselves is also severely limited. At first glance, the idea seemed full of potential. I imagined a true mercenary school, packed with areas to explore, training missions, meaningful interactions, and activities that would reflect the daily life of a military academic institution. However, that expectation is quickly shattered. Both Balam and Galbadia Garden offer very little meaningful interaction or exploration. The environments are static, the rooms serve mostly decorative purposes, and ironically, the player barely learns anything new in a place supposedly dedicated to elite education and training. The biggest symbol of this disappointment is Balam Garden's Training Center. A location that could have been a dynamic and challenging environment instead boils down to 3 simple, repetitive areas, where the only surprise is encountering a roaming T-Rexor, a creature that, to make matters worse, also appears frequently in regular forests on the world map. What should have been a memorable space to test skills, evolve characters, and simulate real missions ends up as just another generic area, stripped of purpose and quickly rendered irrelevant to the player's progression. Problems with the narrative pacing. As said before, another aspect that divides opinions in Final Fantasy VIII is the pacing of the campaign, which at many points becomes excessively slow, linear, and restrictive. Much of the game is marked by long stretches where the player has little control over progression or freedom to explore the world. The story advances rigidly, locking the player into continuous sequences of mandatory events, often without offering natural pauses for exploration or allowing the journey to unfold more organically. Several missions and story events that could have been dynamic end up dragging on far longer than necessary. The Timber mission, for instance, stretches out with repetitive dialogue and movement, undermining the sense of urgency that the narrative tries to convey. The first visit to Galbadia Garden is another example, a long section where the player simply walks down endless corridors with little of real significance happening beyond receiving basic instructions. The escape from the desert prison, which could have been an intense strategic moment, turns into a repetitive cycle of floors, battles, and elevator searches, quickly becoming tedious. The missile base mission, despite having an interesting premise, suffers from the same issues. Long, uneventful stretches and sluggish interactions break the tension that should have been steadily building. The maintenance sequence for Balam Garden at Fisherman's Horizon, while necessary for the garden's development into a mobile fortress, is presented in such a drawn-out, bureaucratic fashion that it drains the sense of adventure with mundane tasks and procedural conversations. Even the dream sequences involving Laguna, which theoretically should enrich the lore, often end up disrupting the pacing of the main narrative. While they are interesting in isolation, these dreams tend to occur abruptly and, more often than not, at inopportune moments, interrupting the natural flow of Squall and his group's story. The pacing issues continue during the arrival in Esthar and the search for Alone at the space station. Once again, the player is pushed into another extended sequence filled with empty hallways, lengthy conversations, and minimal meaningful interaction, stretching out the story at a point where the game should already be building toward its climax. To make things worse, there are so many events happening simultaneously that it's easy to lose track of what's actually important. These sections, which could have been shorter or better balanced with opportunities for exploration and optional objectives, end up making the game's progression feel slow and drawn out. The overall sensation is that, rather than guiding the player smoothly, the game often drags them along, making it harder to stay engaged and diminishing the impact of moments that should have been truly memorable. Positive aspects of the narrative. Despite all its flaws, Final Fantasy VIII's story still holds significant merits that deserve recognition. Much like Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy VII, the game sets out to explore more complex themes such as identity, destiny, and emotional growth, going beyond the typical hero's journey. Squall's character development is, without a doubt, one of the narrative's greatest highlights. His transformation from a cold, introspective, and indifferent young man into someone capable of opening up emotionally and taking on responsibility is built gradually and consistently, serving as the true emotional backbone of the story. Another positive point is the way the plot manages to balance fantasy and politics in an interesting manner. By presenting sorceresses as central figures in the geopolitical struggles between nations, the game adds a deeper layer of world building that gives greater dimension to the conflicts at hand. The sorceresses aren't just mystical antagonists. They are strategic pawns in political power plays that shape the future of entire continents. In addition, Final Fantasy VIII is responsible for some truly memorable and iconic moments that have left their mark on the franchise's history. The Dalit mission, with its tense atmosphere and the Seed exam, the battle against Adia in Delling City, visually striking and loaded with dramatic weight, the transformation of Balam Garden into a mobile base, expanding exploration possibilities, the emotional and grand battle between the gardens, the Lunar Cry phenomenon, which drastically alters the world map, the final confrontation with Cypher, closing out the personal rivalry arc, and the final dungeon, with its dark, challenging tone, all stand out as moments where the game reaches exceptional levels of narrative and aesthetic impact. The romance between Squall and Rinoa, while personally not something that particularly resonates with me, is nonetheless an important element for many players. More than a traditional love story, their relationship acts as a catalyst for Squall's emotional transformation, breaking down the barriers he had built around himself. Even if the construction of their romance has its questionable moments, its influence on the protagonist's development arc is undeniable and adds an extra layer of humanity to the journey. World building. The world of Final Fantasy VIII blends elements of fantasy and science fiction, creating a setting that mixes modern cities, militarized nations, high-tech facilities, and vast, natural landscapes. Unlike most entries in the series, which usually feature medieval kingdoms or post-apocalyptic worlds, FFVIII presents a universe that feels like a natural evolution of our own, with major nations in conflict, advanced academic institutions, and a strong geopolitical undercurrent. The map is divided among 4 major continents, each with its own distinct culture and political influence. Galbadia is the world's largest military power, governed by an authoritarian expansionist regime. Balam is a small island nation, mainly known for hosting Balam Garden, one of the primary seed academies. Trabia is a cold, isolated region, home to Trabia Garden, which is destroyed during Galbadia's campaign. And Estar, the most technologically advanced nation, has remained isolated for years after a devastating war with Galbadia. Beyond these territories, the world is dotted with islands, smaller towns, and secret locations like Shumi Village, the Deep-Sea Research Center, where the GF Bahamut is found, and the ruins of the ancient Centra civilization. World exploration gradually expands as the story progresses. Initially, travel is limited to walking and taking trains between cities, offering very little freedom. Later, players can rent cars, although in practice, almost no one uses them due to the hassle and low necessity. Trains also end up being nearly useless, as their routes are limited, and many connections become unavailable as the story advances. Eventually, Balam Garden transforms into a mobile base, allowing travel across land and sea, and by the end of Disc 3, players acquire the Ragnarok spaceship, finally granting total world exploration, though by that point, it comes a bit too late. Despite this gradual expansion, the sense of freedom is often undermined by how the story constantly forces players into linear missions and dragged-out sections. Even when the world does open up, there's little real incentive to explore. Many areas are purely decorative or quickly become irrelevant after their main narrative purpose is fulfilled. The world building in Final Fantasy VIII is, conceptually, very interesting. However, in practice, it falls short in several areas. Many of the locations, cities, and transportation methods presented are underutilized or so unrewarding that the initial sense of vastness quickly gives way to a feeling of emptiness. A prime example is Balam Garden. The first time I played, I was excited about exploring a mercenary academy with training fields, classrooms, cafeterias, and dormitories. However, as I mentioned earlier, the place offers very little meaningful interaction. If the player follows the main plot without detours, they end up visiting the garden only a handful of times before it becomes a ship, and even after that, it mainly serves as a mobile hub. Galbadia Garden suffers from the same problem. Despite its impressive presentation and strategic importance in the story, it's ultimately just another linear set piece, with little interaction and virtually no incentive to explore beyond the main mission objectives. The same goes for most cities throughout the game. They serve as settings for specific story events and then quickly become hollow and irrelevant afterward. Timber, for instance, offers almost nothing meaningful after the initial Resistance mission, aside from a few generic NPC dialogues. Delling City, which should be a vibrant and politically charged metropolis, also becomes a ghost town after its role in the plot is fulfilled, leaving only a few triple triad card hunts as reasons to revisit. Fisherman's Horizon, after the garden repair sequence, turns into a beautiful but empty location, with maybe one or two minor, nonsensical side quests. Even Balaam, a city with strong sentimental weight in the story, ends up feeling like just another stopover for mandatory interactions or quick missions. This lack of density and ongoing relevance turns what could have been a living, breathing world into a series of beautiful but ultimately hollow maps, weakening the exploration experience and undermining immersion. Like we said, the additional transportation options like cars and trains end up being more trouble than they're worth. Cars require fuel and can only be rented, adding bureaucracy without real benefit. Trains are expensive and have limited schedules and routes, making them practically useless outside of mandatory trips. In the end, the use of Enk Nun to avoid random battles, combined with reliance on Garden and Ragnarok for fast travel, renders most other transportation methods completely redundant. Still, the world isn't entirely empty. There are some genuinely interesting side quests like acquiring Odin or hunting for rare triple triad cards, which reward players who take the time to explore. However, the sheer amount of poorly indicated secrets and the lack of guidance can make the experience frustrating for many. While I personally enjoy games that don't hand everything to the player on a silver platter, Final Fantasy VIII often crosses the line from challenging into discouraging. Don't get me wrong, I genuinely like the world of Final Fantasy VIII. The concept is creative, and the atmosphere is memorable, but the game ultimately delivers less than the expectations it creates, leaving a lingering feeling that its potential was only partially realized as almost everything in this game. Battle system and progression. Battles in Final Fantasy VIII are presented in a fairly straightforward manner, with the real complexity reserved for pre-battle preparation. During combat, the main available commands are attack, draw, magic, GF, and item, along with a few situational extras like card. Although there are other systems in place, many of them end up being underused during the normal gameplay flow. Magic in Final Fantasy VIII works almost like items. Spells must be collected through the draw command from enemies, found at specific draw points on the map, or refined from items. And here lies the first major controversy of the battle system. Magic has always been a central mechanic in Final Fantasy, but in this game, you're actively discouraged, sometimes even penalized, for using it. First, casting a spell reduces the quantity of that magic in your inventory, which directly weakens any stats it's junctioned to. Second, you'll need to spend extra time and effort to replenish that spell later. And third, with a solid junction setup, basic attacks often deal more damage with less hassle. It's not worth it, it brings no tactical advantage, it's more effortful, and it gradually makes your character weaker. In other words, with rare exceptions, you'll probably go through the entire game barely casting any magic at all. GFs have their own HP bars and can be summoned repeatedly as long as they're alive without any direct limitations. GFs are another curious case. Summons have become a trademark of the series, and this game is no exception. But here, they often serve more of a preparatory or support role, with little practical use in battle. In my first playthroughs, I used GFs frequently. I liked the animations, and they dealt decent damage for beginners. But once you understand the system better, physical attacks can easily outperform them, without forcing you to sit through the entire summon animation. There's no real downside to using GFs, but there are definitely more efficient and time-saving alternatives. In the end, most GFs end up serving mainly as containers for junction slots, commands, and passive abilities. There's also a compatibility system that affects how fast a GF is summoned, but let's be honest, nobody really pays attention to it, and it has little to no impact on how you actually play the game. Limit breaks, meanwhile, operate with an element of randomness. The lower a character's HP, the higher the chance to trigger a limit break, adding a layer of strategy to critical moments. Aside from these distinctions, the battle mechanics generally follow the standard RPG formula of the era. Where the system truly sets itself apart is outside the battlefield, in character customization. Attributes like HP, strength, and magic can be enhanced through the junction system, which links magic spells to specific stats, provided the equipped GF has the corresponding junction ability unlocked. Each spell affects different stats in varying degrees, allowing for detailed character tuning. In theory, this offers a highly customizable system, but in practice it's easily broken, especially if you master magic refinement and the card game. With the right junction setup, you can take on virtually any enemy in the game without much effort. That said, I do believe that, with proper balance and polishing, this could have been a truly brilliant mechanic. It's a shame we've never seen anything like it again. In fact, I actually like the junction system. I just know how easily it can be exploited. Additionally, GFs themselves level up, learn new abilities, unlock commands, and gain bonuses by earning ability points, AP, after battles. This is pretty straightforward. You earn AP that rewards you with junction slot, commands, and abilities. Nice and simple mechanics. The real problem arises in the character leveling system. In Final Fantasy VIII, enemies scale with the protagonists, and actually tend to level up slightly faster, which ends up discouraging players from engaging in random battles. Gaining levels, which is usually a natural and rewarding part of RPG progression, becomes more of a burden here. As a result, players often avoid unnecessary fights, focusing only on mandatory battles and collecting magic via draw, or more efficiently, through card refinement. Each character also has a unique mechanic for learning their limit breaks, which is an interesting idea in theory, and something I always thought would have been a great addition in FF7. But here, it ends up being largely irrelevant throughout the gameplay. The problem isn't the idea itself, it's the execution. Most limits are acquired so easily that they actually make it easier to break the game. And truth be told, there are plenty of ways to break this game. As for the limit learning system, it's a cool concept with poor execution, just like most things in this game. You even get a whole menu dedicated to managing limit breaks, which you'll probably never use because you simply don't need to. On top of that, some limits are vastly superior to others, making the whole mechanic unbalanced. It all goes back to how underdeveloped this system is. And speaking of underused features, the GF affinity system is another one. In practice, it means almost nothing. It feels more like an abandoned idea than a meaningful gameplay element. Item usage is also somewhat controversial. While items do have utility in battle, most are mainly used to refine magic and forge new weapons. the only customizable equipment in the game. Weapon upgrades require specific items and some money, but even this system is so simplified that the instructional magazines, which are supposed to provide important information, end up feeling almost irrelevant. As long as you have the right materials and pay the fee, the upgrade happens automatically. The process of acquiring a new weapon is linear and unidimensional. No effort, no decision-making, no variability, just a predictable progression where more expensive weapons simply deal more damage with no other variables involved. Shops for weapons and items, which have always been important in Final Fantasy games, lose much of their relevance here as well, especially since money isn't earned through battles, but through a fixed seed salary. Yet another design choice that kills the motivation for exploration and grinding. And to make matters worse, most weapons barely make a difference when compared even to a mediocre junction setup. Items can also be easily refined from cards, making stores almost completely useless. It's a shame, because I actually like game shops. I miss when they mattered. Complementing the core gameplay, the game introduces the Triple Triad minigame, a card-based system that, despite some complexity with regional rule variations, is genuinely fun and stands as one of the biggest incentives for exploration. Playing cards allows you to acquire valuable items, powerful magic through refinement, and rare materials to forge weapons. However, mastering the card system and the magic refinement mechanics makes the game absurdly easy, turning any sense of difficulty into a casual stroll. It's an interesting system, but one that completely disrupts the game's intended challenge. Triple Triad is a huge paradox. It's simple and complex, easy and frustrating, repetitive, boring, and fun as hell, all at the same time. Then there's the Chocobo minigame, which focuses on obtaining a special card. It's so tedious and obscure that honestly, you're better off just using a guide and sparing yourself the frustration. This is perhaps the greatest source of controversy among fans. All the gameplay ideas introduced are, at their core, good, but most of them suffer from poor execution. The idea of scaling monsters alongside the character's levels, for instance, could have been an elegant solution to avoid excessive grinding. However, the way it was implemented makes engaging in battles feel counterproductive, completely discouraging players from exploring the monster roster or enjoying the combat system. The draw system, another pillar of gameplay, suffers from similar issues. Instead of becoming a strategic and engaging mechanic, it turns into a tedious, time-consuming chore. To make matters worse, the game offers a much more efficient workaround, refining items and cards into powerful spells right from the early stages of the campaign, completely breaking the balance and killing the natural sense of progression. Simple adjustments could have balanced the system without sacrificing player freedom. These problems highlight a recurring pattern. The game frequently discourages random encounters, leaving optional battles with virtually no real purpose. Instead of offering specific rewards or unique abilities from off-story encounters, Final Fantasy VIII pushes players to actively avoid combat by using abilities like Enk Nun, effectively eliminating much of the thrill of exploration and discovery. Despite these structural flaws, I still enjoy most of the mechanics the game proposes. Even though it's extremely easy to break the system with prior knowledge, I often impose personal limitations to keep the experience more challenging and engaging. It's not ideal. A well-designed game should naturally balance itself, but it does allow for some adaptation for players who want to squeeze more out of what the system offers. Ultimately, this might be the game's biggest issue. Final Fantasy VIII offers very little middle ground between complete unfamiliarity and total mastery of its mechanics. You're either a beginner still learning the ropes, or someone who effortlessly steamrolls the game. Even so, whether you're learning or bending the system to your will, Final Fantasy VIII remains a genuinely enjoyable game as long as you avoid falling into the trap of spending countless hours just drawing magic from monsters. Technical aspects. When it comes to the technical side of the game, I'll be extremely brief. The soundtrack is simply perfect, easily one of the best in the entire series, and the graphics are very impressive for their time. Conclusion: Final Fantasy VIII, to me, is the very embodiment of a lack of polish. Maybe that's because its development was split with Final Fantasy IX, or maybe it was simply rushed to release. In my view, every issue the game presents, whether narrative, gameplay, or world building, could have been corrected with a bit more careful finalization. None of the flaws feel insurmountable. On the contrary, most have relatively simple solutions that could have been implemented with just a little more time and attention. And perhaps that's exactly what bothers me most about Final Fantasy VIII. The constant feeling that it could have been so much more than it actually is. If it were a completely bad game, it would be easy to dismiss. But what makes the experience so divisive is precisely the fact that it builds expectations. Expectations that, in many moments, it fails to meet. For some, the creator's intentions are still visible and shine through despite the flaws. For others, what stands out are the missed opportunities and the details that were never fully delivered. Still, even with all its issues, Final Fantasy VIII remains an incredibly easy game to enjoy, to play, and to revisit. I love it. I love the story, I love the mechanics, I love the world they tried to build, even if all of it comes wrapped in imperfections. And I'll keep playing it, rediscovering its strengths and working around its weaknesses, knowing that, even if it's just a shadow of what it could have been, it's still a shadow well worth revisiting.